Income Tax 2020, Practice Problem 1, Part 1, Introduction, Organizing Our Documents. Come in, relax with Income Tax 2020. Here we are in the Lacerte tax software. You don't need the Lacerte tax software to follow along, although I do think they have a 30-day free trial, so if you can get access to a promo version or a demo version of it, it could be a good tool to practice with. We're going to go through a comprehensive problem here, and our goal with the comprehensive problem is to take a look at some of the income items that we focused in on throughout the income section and put them all together in one tax return. So instead of isolating on one particular source of income, we can put them together and see how the accumulation of stuff kind of complicates things a bit and how we can basically organize our information and how all this stuff kind of mingles together when you have different types of income sources. Now, we will be doing this in the tax software, but we will be going back and forth to the forms, and in the following presentation or in a following presentation, we'll also do it with the tax formula. So if you don't have the tax software, you can download these forms from the IRS website at irs.gov, irs.gov, and basically populate the forms. Obviously, the software or some kind of software, doesn't have to be Lacerte software, but the software will make it easier or faster to do the data input. But you can do the data input, like I say, with just basically the forms as well, which you can find on the IRS website. The model that we're going to use to basically do the input is going to be one that's going to give us a double checking type of model. So what we want to do is we want to enter the data into the forms, or in our case, into the software. And then what we're going to do is enter that same data from the source document as well into, say, a tax formula worksheet, say like an Excel type of worksheet. And you can actually have this done by two separate people, or you can have the same person doing it, hopefully doing both items as much as possible from the data input forms that are provided by the client. So that's going to be the format we'll do. We'll focus first on populating the forms, and then we'll populate it into the Excel worksheet. The reason that's useful is because you kind of need a double check to make sure that at least that the data input has been done correctly, because it's really easy to miskey a number in just an individual income tax return because there's no double entry accounting system. There's no assets equal liabilities plus equity because we're only looking at an income statement and not the balance sheet. So it's going to be easier to miskey something, and therefore like a double check entering it in two separate spots from the same source documents can give us kind of a double check on that. So our focus is mainly going to be here on the income section, because that's the section we're on. So we're looking at the documentation related to the income items. Now, typically when you get this from the client, if you're going to get this, say, from a client, or if you populate it or get in your own documentation, you might get it in a paper format, or they might email it to you at this point in time or something like that. Oftentimes, more and more in tax or law or tax firms and CPA firms, they're going to digitize the information, or you might receive it in like a digital format, in a PDF type format. So we'll typically get PDF forms possibly. And then we need to basically organize that information in terms of how are we going to list this stuff out so that we can do then the data input with it. So let's take a look at that now. Let's say if we get forms, I'm going to say we're going to get our forms in our PDF documents. We'll have it in this practice problem 1's docs. So I'll provide this for the course, but if you don't have access to it, then you can just follow along as we go back and forth from the documents to the data input with it. And then within there, we're going to have some of our standard kind of documentation for the data input or income side of things. And so we're going to have our W-2 form, which we're going to basically put in an Excel type of format. We've got our 1099 forms here and whatnot. So the first thing to do is organize this in some way. Now I still kind of like to print the whole thing out. So if I got all these PDFs, I'd still, if it was a big return, kind of like to print the whole thing out, although that's kind of a waste of paper these days, and then have it next to me and sort my stuff next to me. But I'm getting better at basically doing it just in the computer here and sorting the information in the computer. So that's what we'll work with here. Of course, we'll try to open all this stuff up and just sort it and say, well, which one should I enter first and second, and so on and so forth. So typically what I'll have open is I'll have the documentation open, and then I'll also have basically an open items worksheet open, which means I'm just going to have a Word document. You can use whatever program if you like OneNote or Notepads or something like that. I like to have the bullets here, the bullet format. So I'm just going to enter anything that comes into my mind that's just a question when I just start doing the data input. I'm just going to have my mind running, and I'm not going to think about it too much as I do the data input. I'm focused on the data input, but anything that comes up where it's like, that might be a question I want to jot down and ask about, the client about, I want to put all that information down, and I'll basically put all that information down, and I'm going to try to push forward as far as I can go with the tax return before I ask the client the question. So I'm going to do as much as I can to do the data input with everything I have thus far, because I want to limit the time that I nag the client. I want to be able to talk to the client and communicate with the client, but I don't want the back and forth going on forever. I want to basically, push as far as I can with the data that I have, and then put all my notes together, and hopefully have another interaction with the client and be able to get that. So possibly if this is a new client, we'll have an initial interview, most likely, and we'll probably get the documentation, at that point in time. And then we might do the tax return later and give the documentation back. If it's a continuing client, then they might just send us the documentation, right? We got this down to the point where they just basically send us the documentation. And then what we want to do is limit the back and forth, because that's really time consuming. So we want to make sure that we're going all over all the documentation. I'm not going to ask them a question every time something pops into my head. I'm going to do the whole thing and then try to figure out all the questions that would be relevant, and then do the further communication. So yeah, and you might have a lot of back and forth in any case, but I would try to work on streamlining that, because it can take up time. So then we're going to just then I would open up all the documents. So I'm going to open all this stuff up and just start basically the data input. Now I'm just going to open it up into a PDF reader format. So this is basically a free program. I like to open it up on the desktop, so it's not opened up in an internet browser page. So this is Adobe Read, which I believe is free. So, and then if I open them all up, they'll be in this tab up top. So I'm going to open them all up to the tab up top. Now note, these are practice files, so you're going to have to scroll down a little bit to find the data, because the form on top will be the red form. They won't let me populate the red form. So you're going to have to scroll down. We go down to here, and there's going to be our 1099 dividend. And here, if I scroll down here, this is going to be our 1099 from the broker. Okay, and then I'm just going to open all these up. I'm going to say, all right. And here's going to be our 1099, another 1099 dividend that we're going to open up. So I'll scroll down to that. So there is that. And then I've got the unemployment. I've got a 1099G. All right, so I'm going to open that up. Scroll down. So there's the 1099G information. And then we've got another 1099G. So all right, two 1099Gs. That's unusual, but that's okay. So I'm going to scroll down and go to that one. And then we've got a 1099 interest form. So I'm going to open that up. That's somewhat standard. So I got the 1099 interest. So we'll find that. And then we've got 1099 interest number 2. So second 1099 interest form. Scrolling down. Okay. And then we've got a W-2. Now the W-2, they won't let me populate the W-2. So just note, this is an example of this is a W-2G form. They let me populate that form, but they won't let me populate a normal W-2 form. So I did that basically in this Excel worksheet. So the Excel worksheet is in essence our W-2 form. Maybe I can make this into a PDF. Let me do that real quick. Okay, so now I've made W-2 forms. They're kind of mock W-2 forms. So I got W-2-1 form, and these are not official forms. These are coming from an Excel file that basically looks kind of like a W-2. So similar information. So we got the W-2 there, and if you want to look at an example of a W-2, obviously you can find it on the IRS website, irs.gov. And then here's the second W-2 form. So I'll open up all the forms, and then typically, whether it's on my desk or if I have it in something like this, I'll then organize it to what I think is the most important first, meaning I'm not just going to input it in the order, like alphabetical order when I opened it. Like I'm not going to enter the stock broker proceeds first, because the most important thing is probably going to be the W-2 income for most people. And note, this will be different if you're dealing with someone that's going to be like older individuals might have different primary sources of income, like retirement information income or something like that. If you're talking about people that are in their working part of their life and whatnot, then probably the W-2 is probably the most important item. It's important to put those in first, because that'll give you kind of a context or overview of what happens overall. Also note that when you do the W-2 information, you will be picking up, you can pick up the information to start a new return. So if we hadn't used or if we hadn't done this return in the past, then we're going to have the Social Security number and the name and the address and stuff should all be on the W-2's return. So that's what I'll usually organize these. I'm going to pull these over and say, let's put that at the beginning then, like put this in the front, because that's the first one. And then I'm going to do the W-2 too. So that's going to be the second one. And then I'll start into the 1099s. And not the most important to do the 1099 orders, probably not as important. But I'll typically go with the interest first, because the interest is going to be from the banks. And oftentimes when you look at the dividends, it could be the case where you got dividends, interest, and proceeds from like broker sales of stocks and bonds all mingled together, basically, because they're all from the same institution. So it's kind of difficult to separate those out when you're trying to double check them, because they could all be on the same 1099 form. Now, it's more likely possible that the interest will be broken out than the brokerage on the sales on the brokerage. The brokerage data input is often a little bit more complex, and I'll usually save that till a little bit later to do. So I'll go, okay, let's do the W-2s. It's nice and easy, and that's the most important. And then I'll do the 1099s for the interest. So 1099 interest, there we got those. And then again, it's not totally important on the order now, but usually I then go to the dividends. So I'm going to go, okay, this is the broker. I'll take the broker after the dividends. And those two things might come together. And then we got this other stuff. It's kind of miscellaneous information, like gambling winnings. And then you got this is the state tax refund. And then we've got gambling winnings here. What was this one? This one was proceeds from the broker. This one is, this is unemployment compensation. So all those are going to usually be smaller kind of amounts towards the end. So this is basically, if I just have these income documents, this is how I would format them. Now note that when you start getting into the expenses and whatnot, those are things you're probably going to enter afterwards. So once you start looking at itemized deductions, which we'll talk about in a future presentation, we're not going to get into the itemized deductions and all that kind of stuff and the other expenses. But normally, this is how you would possibly start populating the return, because you're going to get the income documentation. That's the documentation that you're going to have the primary information in on it. And you might have to dig a little deeper on the expense side of things to dive into like itemized deductions and whatnot, which we'll do in future presentations. You also often will have a note from the client, especially if it's a new client, but continuing clients too, that might say this is what changed from last year to this year. And you might want to obviously read through that, make any notes about it. But then your data input's probably going to start straightforward, with the W-2s. So then we'll enter the W-2s. And again, if it's a new client, then the W-2 information will have most of the data necessary to enter into the system. So the starting point for a new client, we would go back on over and say, all right, well, this individual, and we would probably have the prior year tax return as well. You'd want the prior year tax return if possible. Ask about any major tax related changes from the prior year. Like, did you get married? Did you get a new house? Job changes, income level changes, kids, whatnot. So then, and then we do the data input here. So, right, I'm going to say it's a California return. I won't be focusing in on California, but just to show that you can have a state that would be included. And then we're going to say that they're going to be married, filing joint. Now, again, we can kind of guess that from the documentation. If I got W-2s from two individuals, then I can kind of guess that. But obviously, that is something that we would get either from the prior tax return or by discussion with the client. And then we can populate this information for the two people, and this information can basically be coming from directly the W-2s. So again, I can get most of this information just straight from the W-2. That's going to be name, social security number, and then occupation I may not know. Like, I might be guessing that, right? I may not know their occupation. That's what you want to guess in the initial interview. So I might jot that down. Occupation. Now, if I don't know that, I'm just going to keep pushing forward. And I usually won't, I could correct the spelling here if I want to. I'll correct it before I email it to somebody usually. And then the date of birth we might not have. Date of birth. So you might be jotting that down as you go. It's not going to stop me from pushing forward here, but I'm going to need that to finalize the return if I didn't get it in the initial interview process. So date of death, they probably don't know that yet, because hopefully it's sometime in the future. And then the dependency status is typically, I'm going to say not applicable because they're not going to be a dependent. And then Jane, again, we could typically get this information for both spouse from the W-2 if she has a W-2 or some other kind of documentation. And again, we might not know the occupation. we happen to this time. She's the master of the universe. But but if we don't know that, then we can jot that down. And then we got the date of birth. Again, we might not know that, so we can then ask about that as well, but it wouldn't stop us from pushing forward. And then we've got the general starting information for the where they live, which again would typically be on the W-2 form. So we might verify that, but obviously this information typically on the W-2 form. So obviously they live in 90210 Beverly Hills, and then you got the home address and whatnot, and then the telephone number and whatnot, which may not be on any of the documentation, but obviously you'd probably have their contact information if you're working with a client. And that's the starting point. So if we go back on over to the forms, then we're going to say, all right, they're married filing joint. We should be able to match this up to the prior tax return, whether we did it or not. And it should be the same unless they told us otherwise. If they told us otherwise, then we want to make sure we have a questionnaire or something like that asks questions like, did you get married? Did you get divorced? Did you have another kid? School change, income level change, job changes, and whatnot. And then we've got the two individuals, social security numbers on the right. We've got then the address all pulled basically from the W-2 form, and that's where I'm going to stop at this point in time. Now, other information like dependents and whatnot, obviously that's going to be stuff that we're going to have in the interview process as well, and things that we can get from the prior tax return. And then remember, the prior tax return is always our starting point. Typically, it's always our starting point. Whether we did the return last year, which means if we did, it would already be populated in the system, or not, which means first thing we do is ask for the prior year tax return so that we get an idea of where it looks. And if it's a complex tax return in the prior year, I wouldn't just start entering it in 2020, but I would go back to 2019 software if I had availability to do so, enter their 2019 tax return into the software, try to match it up as close I can with what actually was generated, what was given to me from the 2019 tax return, and then check if there's any errors on it. Is there any amendments we need to make on it? Because if this is a long-term client and their tax return is somewhat difficult, I want to make it, a long-term, it's the commitment, right? We want to do it right. And so I want to get a feel for it by putting it into 2019 and then roll it over or pro forma it into 2020. But if it's a more basic return, and I don't have any carryovers, and possibly I'm not itemizing, or, I don't have, that would be my general rule. If I'm itemizing, or if I have any carryovers, then I would typically put it into 2019 for a new client and then roll it over. But again, you don't have to do that, and then you enter into 2020. But even if you don't do that, then you're still looking at 2019 as basically the base return, and then asking about any changes from that point. And that, of course, will tell you a whole lot about where they stand, because people don't, usually 1 year doesn't change that much. Although 2020 could be an exception to the general rule. But in any case, so that's going to be the information. So then I'm going to go straight through, and I'm just going to start entering the data in from our forms here, and I would pick them up one at a time this way, and then just delete them off of our open items here as we start to populate those forms. Jotting down any questions as we go.